Hello everyone. In this video I'll be reading the very beginning of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice and stopping to explain a few key concepts. I have some Janeite paraphernalia with me as well. So this is my Jane Austen mug with several quotes from various novels, including the famous first sentence of Pride and Prejudice. I also have with me my second favorite Jane Austen novel, Persuasion, right after Pride and Prejudice. This is Polly Shulman's Enthusiasm, a very cute young adult book, loosely inspired by Pride and Prejudice. This is my very fancy leather-bound edition of Pride and Prejudice and Northanger Abbey. And this is the Jane Austen Handbook by Margaret C. Sullivan. So my students will be reading a few excerpts from this book just to get a better sense of Regency era, Jane Austen's time period, customs, culture, and societal expectations. When I read, I'm going to be reading from the Barnes & Noble Classic edition of Pride and Prejudice. They have an introduction on here. I'm just going to issue a caveat to my students that when you're reading a work of classic literature, you should usually skip the introduction. Most booksellers will assume that if you're purchasing the book, you've already read it, and you should be familiar with the contents of the plot. So, because of that, most introductions are full of spoilers and will entirely give away the plot, characterization, all of those things that you should really be discovering for yourselves. So always skip the introduction when you're reading any kind of a classic. We typically would read from the Barnes & Noble Classic editions, but because we're moving to Google Classroom, I'm going to put the link to the Project Gutenberg edition of Pride and Prejudice. For those of you who don't know, Project Gutenberg is an excellent resource. They have all public domain works of literature available for you to read on your own. The Project Gutenberg does not have an introduction, so you'll just start with Chapter 1. So here's Chapter 1. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. It's one of the most famous first sentences in all of literature. So what does it mean? It is a truth universally acknowledged, so everyone knows that a single man, a guy who is not married, in possession of a good fortune, so a single rich guy must need a wife. What's Jane Austen's tone when she's writing that sentence? We have to look at paragraph 2 to understand. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighborhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered as the rightful property of some one or other of their daughters. So in other words, it doesn't really matter what this guy thinks or what he wants to do. When he comes into this neighborhood, all of the families want to snatch him up for their daughters to marry. This is a sarcastic first sentence. So Jane Austen doesn't truly believe that every rich guy needs to have a wife right away, but that's the expectation that many people in this society have. "My dear Mr. Bennet," said his lady to him one day, "have you heard that Netherfield Park is let at last?" Mr. Bennet replied that he had not. "But it is," returned she, "for Mrs. Long has just been there, and she told me all about it." Mr. Bennet made no answer. "Do you not want to know who has taken it?" cried his wife, impatiently. "You want to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it." This was invitation enough. "Why, my dear, you must know. Mrs. Long says that Netherfield is taken by a young man of large fortune from the north of England, that he came down on Monday in a chaise and four to see the place, and was so much delighted with it that he agreed with Mr. Morris immediately, that he is to take possession before Michaelmas, and some of his servants are to be in the house by the end of next week." "What is his name?" "Bingley." "Is he married or single?" "Oh, single, my dear, to be sure. A single man of large fortune, 4,000 or 5,000 a year. What a fine thing for our girls." "How so? How can it affect them?" "My dear Mr. Bennet," replied his wife, "how can you be so tiresome? You must know that I am thinking of his marrying one of them." So clearly, Mrs. Bennet follows the expectation set forth in that first sentence in the second paragraph, that she's planning on having one of her daughters marry this rich guy who just moved into the very nice, fancy house in the neighborhood. Her husband, Mr. Bennet, is not quite as into this, marrying off his daughter's scheme as Mrs. Bennet is. So Mr. Bennet is speaking now. "Is that his design in settling here?" "Design? Nonsense! How can you talk so? but it is very likely that he may fall in love with one of them, and therefore you must visit him as soon as he comes. I see no occasion for that. You and the girls may go, or you may send them by themselves, which perhaps will be still better, for you are as handsome as any of them. Mr. Bingley might like you best of the party. My dear, you flatter me. I certainly have my share of beauty, but I do not pretend to be anything extraordinary now. When a woman has 5 grown-up daughters, she ought to give over thinking of her own beauty. In such cases, a woman has not often much beauty to think of. But, my dear, you must indeed go and see Mr. Bingley when he comes into the neighborhood. It is more than I engage for, I assure you. But consider your daughters. Only think what an establishment it would be for one of them. Sir William and Lady Lucas are determined to go merely on that account, for in general, you know, they visit no newcomers. Indeed, you must go, for it will be impossible for us to visit him if you do not. So Mrs. Bennet's asking her husband to go visit Mr. Bingley and make it so that they can have an introduction to him. In Regency England, it was an expectation that you had to have some sort of an in, you had to kind of know someone before you were introduced to them. So Mr. Bennet sort of has to go see Mr. Bingley if Mrs. Bennet wants her daughters to meet and then eventually marry him. You are over scrupulous, surely. I dare say Mr. Bingley would be very glad to see you, and I will send a few lines by you to assure him of my hearty consent to his marrying whichever he chooses of the girls, though I must throw in a good word for my little Lizzie. I desire you will do no such thing. Lizzie is not a bit better than the others, and I am sure she is not half so handsome as Jane, nor half so good-humoured as Lydia, but you are always giving her the preference. They have none of them much to recommend them, replied he. They are all silly and ignorant like other girls, but Lizzie has something more of quickness than her sisters. Mr. Bennet, how can you abuse your own children in such a way? You take delight in vexing me. You have no compassion on my poor nerves. You mistake me, my dear. I have a high respect for your nerves. They are my old friends. I have heard you mention them with consideration these 20 years at least. Ah, you do not know what I suffer. But I hope you will get over it and live to see many young men of 4,000 a year come into the neighborhood. It will be no use to us if 20 such should come, since you will not visit them. Depend upon it, my dear, that when there are 20, I will visit them all. Mr. Bennet was so odd a mixture of quick parts, sarcastic humor, reserve, and caprice, that the experience of 23 years had been insufficient to make his wife understand his character. Her mind was less difficult to develop. She was a woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. When she was discontented, she fancied herself nervous. The business of her life was to get her daughters married. Its solace was visiting and news. So that's our first chapter. Already we get a pretty clear sense of who Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Bennet are. We know that she's obsessed with marrying off her daughters. Jane Austen calls her a woman of mean understanding, so she has sort of narrow interests. She's not the smartest character, little information and uncertain temper. So she will sometimes make assumptions without knowing the whole story, and her moods can swing dramatically. Mr. Bennet, we learn that he's sarcastic, that he's reserved at times, that he's very humorous, and he's capricious. So he sort of just goes along with whatever impulse takes him at the moment. He does delight in vexing Mrs. Bennet. He's constantly teasing her throughout this whole chapter. He sort of makes some sarcastic comments and burns towards her. So she says, when a woman has 5 grown-up daughters, she ought to give over thinking of her own beauty. And Mr. Bennet says, in such cases, a woman has not often much beauty to think of. So he's calling his wife not that beautiful anymore. She mentions her nerves. She's a very nervous character, very easily worried. We'll see more of that play out. But Mr. Bennet says that I've, been used to all of your nerves and you constantly mentioning how nervous you are for all of these years that we've been married. Should also mention that Mrs. Bennet doesn't get his sarcasm. So 23 years of marriage hasn't been enough for her to say, oh, now he's kidding, he's being funny here. Nope. So he'll often make a sarcastic remark and it'll completely go over her head. We also learn a little bit about the Bennet daughters in this chapter. So we find out that Lizzie is his favorite daughter. He says she has something more of quickness, so she may be a little sharper, wittier than her sisters. We find out that Jane is very pretty and Lydia is very good-humored, fun-loving, easygoing, and happy. And that's our first chapter.